Hey everyone, I'm Mike from thegamepreview.com, and this is our review for Kingdoms of Amalur Re-Reckoning. This is available on PS4, Xbox One, and PC platforms, but the footage you are seeing here is reviewed on Xbox One X. I would also like to mention that the footage you are seeing here will not spoil anything from the main game. It's from the DLC, The Teeth of Naros, so nothing to fear there. Without further delay, let's get started. When I first jumped into my playthrough of Kingdoms of Amalur Re-Reckoning, I was genuinely excited. I personally never had the opportunity to play the original back when it released in 2012, but I had a very few select couple of friends who did. Back then, especially with one friend in particular to my recollection, I was told that it was an incredible RPG that could go toe to toe with the likes of world renowned titles such as Skyrim. Being only a kid, I took their word for it but still never spent the money to try it out for myself. Over the following years, I started to believe that I may have missed out on something truly special. With a game that was designed by Ken Rolston of Oblivion fame, with art created by Todd McFarlane, and a story penned by R.A. Salvatore, how could it not be spectacular? Well, after all this lost time, I finally caved and pre-ordered Re-Reckoning, hoping this enhanced remastered version would have made the long wait worthwhile. It is worth mentioning, however, that we did receive a review copy as well, courtesy of THQ Nordic, but it arrived later than my own personal copy, which is what this review will be based off of. So, was fate kind and bestowed a title of the ages upon me, or is Kingdoms of Amalur just an average, run-of-the-mill RPG experience? And to start, we will begin with narrative. Story and lore are by far the most important components of a role-playing game in my opinion, so I feel it should be discussed first. Don't worry about any spoilers though, as you won't find any here. When you first awaken from death and are thrusted into the war against the evil Tuatha, the story that is presented to you is initially intriguing. The exposition of the seemingly deep lore in the world is done well, and did captivate me with compelling backstory and characters, but those feelings were fleeting. As I progressed through the game, I lost interest in all this over time as it failed to keep me enthralled all the way through. By the conclusion, I ended up not caring all that much about the world and found it to be mostly unremarkable and not that memorable. I was encouraged to find out more about the world and its lore filled mysteries either. Or, I wasn't encouraged, rather. My apologies, as most of those details are behind quick 1 to 2 sentence conversations with generic NPCs you'll find in any RPG, whose dialogue was boring enough to the point where I would just read the subtitles quickly and not let them finish talking and just skip over what they had to say. The main questline is by far the best storyline in the title, but I'd say objectively it's just okay, nothing exceptional whatsoever. However, choice is a complete illusion throughout the main quest, which is extremely counterintuitive considering the premise of your character. Without delving into spoilers, the entire world of Amalur and its inhabitants are governed by the laws of fate, with all destinies being predetermined at birth. When your character rises from the dead at the beginning of the game, you quickly find out that you are immune to the cycle of fate, and that you have the power to turn the tide of the war and restore peace to Amalur in the face of a generic villain with generic world-conquering goals. Unfortunately, that's all for show, as the main questline's events are set in stone from start to finish. The only thing you can alter is the dialogue spoken. Even with a maxed out persuasion skill, which I had, and soon realized was a waste of all of my leveling, there are certain choices presented to the player that actually do make a difference in the way events play out, yet these choices are reserved only for the faction side questlines, and usually only pop up at the end of said questlines with just 2 possible paths to pursue. There are multiple factions throughout the game, 5 by my count, yet I only found one of them, being the House of Ballads, to be unique. The rest were, like many other narrative aspects of this game, generic, to the point where I could draw similarities with other RPG faction questlines left and right. If these faction quests were more fleshed out and possibly a little bit longer, they could have easily become the best narrative components of the game, seeing as how your choices actually have an effect here. Besides the main quest and factions, there are plenty of standard side quests as well, but they are just as numerous as they are bland. They usually consist of uncompelling fetch quests used to fill out the game world and justify the existence of certain NPCs, but nothing more. To be candid, these side quests felt as if they belonged in an MMORPG. Overall, I expected a much more in-depth plot with varied choice and multiple sprawling outcomes typical of a single-player RPG, but I was disappointed in what I found instead. And that leads us to gameplay and atmosphere. And if I had to sum up the gameplay of Kingdoms of Amalur Re-Reckoning in one word, it would have to be average. At first, combat is easy to grasp and fun with varied animations, movesets, and executions, but becomes extremely basic and overly repetitive very early on. Most of the time you'll just be mashing X, square, or left mouse button to do your standard attack, as the damage of your special abilities, even when fully upgraded, is negligible compared to that standard attack. Additionally, although rarely, sometimes attacks won't even register, seemingly phasing through your enemy combatants. Furthermore, you will be ganked, which if you aren't familiar with the term means being outnumbered by a large group of opposing enemies and pretty much annihilated, all the time in combat, and it can be difficult to get attacks in since every time you take a hit you get stun locked, which can be stacked if you continue to get hit while stuck in that stun lock. Assuming you're proficient at timing your dodges and blocks, however, still doesn't matter, since there are some enemy attacks that are both unblockable and undodgeable, leading to cheap force damage in our first example of artificial difficulty in Kingdoms of Amalur. Outside of clashing blades, the rest of the gameplay doesn't seem to fare much better either. The game is open world, yet this has to be one of, if not the most linear open world game I have ever played. There are large areas spread throughout the land of Amalur, but there are specific pathways connecting area to area that you must travel through in order to gain access to them. Even after unlocking fast travel locations, you'll be retreading the same ground quite often. Expect a lot of running around. The locales of the different regions are diverse enough from each other, but there isn't much variation whatsoever when it comes to areas within those regions. This is most noticeable when it comes to areas such as dungeons or caves, as most of these look identical and definitely copy and paste some assets, leading to these locations becoming chores after about 5 hours in. The world in general, though, feels empty and desolate. It doesn't feel lived in, with most open spaces filled with nothing but repetitive enemies of varying color palettes, with NPCs relegated to towns only. It's incredibly rare to find NPCs outside of a settlement in the wild. I believe I only found 2 throughout my playthrough. Speaking of NPCs, sometimes you will have 1 or 2 follow you for the duration of a quest, acting as a temporary companion of sorts. This is a curse more so than a blessing, however, as they follow way too close to the player. This leads to frustration when you're attempting to loot items and the NPC's dialogue options repeatedly open up instead. These follower NPCs also seek enemy engagements that the player may be trying to avoid or sneak past, which also leads to anger. If you do manage to pick up your loot, you'll be immediately greeted with yet another annoyance. Inventory space, even though upgradable, is extremely limited in Kingdoms of Amalur. Although most egregious in the early game, this problem will latch onto the player for the duration of their entire playthrough, requiring constant management and providing an insanely irritating gameplay loop. Before we discuss atmosphere, I did want to mention that the lockpick in the title, or the lockpicking rather, is very inconsistent, and possibly broken to say the least. For one example, lockpicks used on average difficulty chests break just as easily as they would on hard difficulty chests, sometimes even easier. Another thing I'd like to mention is that there is a massive, and I do mean massive, artificial difficulty spike at the second to last main quest, which forced me to reload a save and do monotonous side activities to level up my character. Keep in mind, if I had no multiple save slots, I would have had to reload an autosave from about 3 hours back or restart the game entirely. There was no gradual progression of difficulty. In fact, I was wiping the floor with everything prior to this, but the difficulty just jumps up insanely high for no natural reason. It was clearly instituted to pad out the game's length, a development strategy that I am firmly against. However, it could also be due to the game being ridiculously easy outside of cheap ganks, as I only died once on normal difficulty, which was only due to my own idiocy, as I tried to grab loot out from under some man-eating two-shotting plants. Despite all these criticisms, one thing the title radiates with is passion, with a glorious art style and ambient music as the backdrop. They mesh together beautifully and complement each other swimmingly. It sets a wonderful sense of fantastical atmosphere, and even though visually dated, is still a treat to look at and listen to throughout the player's journey. The atmosphere is further bolstered by unique and interesting character models, whether they are enemies or non-hostile NPCs, undoubtedly courtesy of Todd McFarlane's art. The gameplay does indeed have many faults, but it isn't downright terrible at all, and the engaging atmosphere makes it a bit more worthwhile to deal with. It's just average. When it comes to the content on offer, and at an asking price of $39.99 US dollars, the content within Kingdoms of Amalur Re-Reckoning is proportionate to the cost. That is, only if you find the title enjoyable enough to continuously play it all the way through. I completed my playthrough at level 23 after 18 hours of gameplay, though for completionists it could take roughly upwards of 40 hours. Personally though, I don't believe the game warrants a 100% playthrough, but to each their own I suppose. Additionally, all Armor DLC in both story expansions, one of which you are seeing right now, are included as well, which provides approximately 5 to 15 hours of additional content depending on your playstyle and speed. When it comes to performance and glitches, and we'll start with performance, the game runs buttery smooth for the most part. However, I did experience around 3 instances of frame drops throughout my playthrough, but all in all, that's not that bad. When it comes to the topic of glitches though, I experienced a massive amount. They're mostly minor to be fair, but combined they become an enraging irritant. The glitches and bugs I encountered in Kingdoms of Amalur Re-Reckoning are as follows, and I'm just going to list them in a list format because there are quite a few. And most of them are audio related. There's dialogue with no sound, dialogue with overtly loud sound. Dialogue in general is quiet compared to other audio for seemingly no reason. Dialogue can be heard from far away if a voice line has yet to be finished and the player leaves the area. Audio glitch upon game startup where all sound is absurdly loud and staticky, genuinely hurting my ears momentarily. Infrequent but noticeable screen tearing. Several instances where player character's lower body is invisible upon loading a save game. Forced a very easy lock with a 100% success rate due to skill, and the lockpick still broke. The chest remained locked. 2 instances where the game black screened and crashed to the Xbox dashboard, one of which was during the final boss of the main quest, so you can imagine how that felt. To wrap things up though, and to be blunt, Kingdoms of Amalur Re-Reckoning was not the game I expected it to be at all. With the creative powerhouse that was responsible for it when it was originally developed by Big Huge Games, I thought that when Kaiko remastered it, I was in for a treat. Sure, there were some compelling aspects of the game, particularly the atmosphere, but the story and gameplay provided offered nothing out of the status quo for RPGs. On top of the myriad of poor design choices and rampant glitches, the boring and bland world of Amalur was a major detraction from my enjoyment of the title as well. Kingdoms of Amalur clearly had passion behind it, but that means nothing without the proper ambition. I wanted so much more from Kingdoms of Amalur Re-Reckoning, but I was unfortunately let down by a slightly above average experience and a world beaming with untapped potential. TGP's final score for Kingdoms of Amalur Re-Reckoning is a 6.5 out of 10 for a slightly above average RPG experience. If you're looking for something more in-depth, something with more content, something that you can further immerse yourself in, this is not the game for you. If you are just looking for an RPG to play, something that's new, and you're fine with nothing being extraordinary or exceptional, then this could very well be a title for you. I wouldn't recommend it at $40 unless you plan to play through the entirety of the game and all of its content, so I would probably recommend waiting for a price drop around 40 to 50% off. Well, that's been me. I've been Mike for thegamepreview.com. If you want the full written review without any of my speech gaps, feel free to visit thegamepreview.com where this is posted on our homepage. And if you like these video reviews, be sure to subscribe so you can catch the next one.